go wrong. Denis Lazavik he did strike back against the world number one. He has the potential to strike back against Alireza. Will he manage to do it? He starts with 1d4, and we're going to see a Nimzo Indian.
I think that for Denis Lazavik, it is really against his nature to play some random risky line. He plays solid. Even this opening, he's playing e3, which is the most principled, classical way to handle this. You are allowing yourself to get double pawns, sure, but in return, you control the center. So this is, I think, a good start for Denis. We'll see if Alireza plays some of the forcing lines with his pawn pushing in the center, but those kind of pawn pushes with White getting the bishop pair, there are some risks attached. David, I have to say, I think Alireza should not be displeased with the start.
That's for sure, Robert. And I like the fact that Alireza is pausing. He's not rushing his moves here with black because potentially he didn't expect this this variation. But also, he's fighting his natural instincts. We mentioned Alireza. He wants to play a really imbalanced position, but he doesn't need to here. A draw is enough. And there we go. We see a quick kind of breaking of the central tension, a quick exchange. And Denis has actually had this position before. I remember commentating on some of those games, so Alireza must have prepared this. And there we go. White with an isolated queen's pawn, but with some attacking chances. Queen to d3. Watch out for that one next. White can play around that. And yeah, this is still well-known stuff. Very well-known theory. And yeah, Tanya, do you think that this is a wise choice from Denis, not surprising the opponent? He's in his home comfort, his home territory here, but yeah, still super solid for black.
Super solid, but it's imbalanced, David. The pawn structure is imbalanced. Like you said, the isolated queen's pawn gives black the long-term advantage. If pieces are traded off, that suits black just fine. But for Denis, having this pawn in the center, it gives him those ideas of trying to create a kingside attack. We could see the queen and the bishop line up on the diagonal. The knight from c3 could jump onto e3. The knight from e2 will try to aim to land on a kingside square via g3 at some point. There are these ideas, and having an imbalanced pawn structure, it does create chances for both players. We see this retreating move, but it's often to go forward next. Black wants to try to aim to put that bishop on f6, not only targeting that d4 pawn, but it can be a key defender for all these kingside attacking ideas that we're pointing out once black gets g6 and is able to fianchetto the bishop. We're seeing all of this being played out. I'm also expecting Alireza at some point to go b6, bishop b7. Meanwhile, for white to finish development. It's a long game, but I would say in a must-win situation, Denis should be pleased with the opening outcome. What do you think, Robert?
At first, I was saying that Alireza should not be unhappy, but the way Alireza's played the last few turns, it shows me that he wants to make a draw, but it's not comfortable for him either. He's not someone who just likes to play passively, not really get a full game of it. He wants peace tension. He wants dynamics. So I think both players are struggling with the match situation. Denis, he needs to win, and yet we're in a position where he has this isolated pawn, and black is blockading nicely. Alireza, he just needs a draw. As David said, he's not really comfortable just sitting and doing nothing. It's not to his liking. So as Alireza keeps thinking, you look at Denis's clock, and you're like, well, why not just play on? Then later in the game, go for something perhaps speculative or puts the black king in danger. David, I have to say that Alireza, the way he's been playing thus far, suddenly it's concerning me because I don't think he feels quite at home.
It feels like, as we mentioned, fighting those instincts, fighting the kind of temptation to play something a bit more kind of ambitious, aggressive. Instead, he's just trying to be super solid as black, and that's totally fair enough. That's kind of what we expected with the match situation. But I think you're right, Robert. The clock situation gives it away. Alireza's already down 2 minutes. Some of the moves he's made as well, it doesn't feel like he's too comfortable at all. Denis's moves, on the other hand, really natural. Bishop to h6 gains a tempo against the black rook. The white rooks now will flood towards the center. Firstly, you have to choose squares. I'm always a bit tentative about which squares to choose. Is it d1, e1, c1? But that's Denis's choice, luckily, not mine. And it will come down to whether at some point Firouzja can just break the tension, trade off some pieces, and guide it towards safety. Even if he's not comfortable here, Tanya, even if this isn't his kind of normal play zone, Firouzja, his moves are natural as well. Bishop to b7, next move, and yeah, it's hard to imagine anything going wrong, at least in the near future.
And I saw a featured chat there saying that if Alireza plays for a draw, he will lose. And I think very often that is, we see that happen quite a bit. When a player just needs a draw, you don't take those objective decisions. You play too much for a draw, going against your own instincts, going against your own intuition. And that can backfire. But Ali Reza, right? We saw him, what he did in his match against Jan Nepomniachtchi. He traded off all the pieces when he needed to, even though he had a better position, because that worked for the match. We're seeing him with that similar approach here. He wants to try to keep things under control. But again, I'm going to repeat, I think for Dennis, he's got reasons to be pleased with this outcome. It isn't better for White. Black's doing fine. Yes, he's got the IQP with White, but it still feels like there are so many pieces on the board. Not a single set of minor pieces has been traded off. If ever Black takes on C3 at any moment, White can recapture with the B pawn, making sure that the B pawn and the C pawn are connected, and there's no more IQP. You were talking about who is it easier to play. I also see moves like Rook E1, Rook D1 coming in. This is going to be a big fight, Robert.
It is, and I think for Denis, he will have to follow up this move, Queen F3, which I like. Follow this one up quickly. There's already an idea. Can I take on D5? Then Black will be saddled with an isolated pawn. But what you need to calculate is, can Black take with the Queen? I'm not so sure, as Bishop E4 comes to mind, and now there's some problems on the diagonal. And if Knight takes D5, E takes D5, you both get isolated pawns. It's about who can operate around it. But instead, Denis saying, I don't want symmetry. I'm going to place my bishop on E4. Tanya, your point is well taken. Knight takes C3. You can take back with the pawn and sort of fix your pawn structure, or at least transition from isolated pawn to a bit of a hanging pawn structure. And hanging pawn structures are known for their dynamic opportunities. David, I have to say, the last couple of moves, both players are playing accurately. Good chess, but I still am liking how the game is going from White's perspective, at least until I just saw this move, Knight A5. That is a very good decision from Alireza.
A very good decision. He's essentially just preparing for all of these exchanges. Now, if White does take on D5, we'll see bishops, knights, queens potentially even disappear, and not good news for Denis Lazavik in a situation he needs to win. That will just fizzle out towards equality. So now this stronghold, that one square that you've highlighted there, the red square, D5, Black can play around it. The Black knight might come into C4, Black's rook will come to C8. I also want to mention one kind of thing for Denis Lazavik to worry about. He's not used to having worse pawn structures. We talk about him as a grinder. He loves just having kind of really harmonious structures where he's got the kind of the long-term trumps up his sleeve. I think the pressure of having the isolated queen's pawn that we've been talking about, that is not an easy kind of structure to handle. So wise choice maybe from Firouzja, and Black's position, as with you, Robert, I feel it's growing on me. Looks like Firouzja, he's stabilized, and that is the key here. Tanya, you mentioned you liked White's natural moves. What do you think he should be doing next? What's the next step for Denis Lazavik in his quest for victory?
Well, Dennis is in a thing, so it can't be that easy. If you have to play intuitively here, you think about bringing your rooks to the game. Either the rook comes to E1 or the other rook comes to C1. But the bigger question I think about this position has to be more of an overview, because we might even see a pawn structure transformation. From an isolated queen's pawn, in a couple of moves, we might see a fixed pawn structure in the center with the trades on D5. And I think we have to think and talk about that, because if Black is able to get a pawn on D5 and White has a pawn on D4. And imagine all the pieces, the bishop, the light squared bishops traded off, the knights are traded off, the queens are off the board, and you get this pawn structure. Then the fact that Alireza has a dark squared bishop which can target D4, and Denis will be left with a dark squared bishop which cannot target D5, that works in Alireza's favor. So trades are super important. He avoids them right now because I really think he needs to keep pieces on the board. He needs to continue playing with this isolated queen's pawn and not go for that fixed center.
That was a very good and deep point by Tanya, that this D4 pawn is on the same color as this bishop on E7, which means the bishop can go after it, and White's bishop on a dark square can't go after any of the light pawns. So look at Denis. He first brings his rook to a fully open file. I would expect that Black is tempted to do the same. But now we are speaking about tactics. And this D5 knight may be captured here. And I just want to go down one quick little rabbit hole of analysis, because rook C8, I think that's a move you play, an automatic move. But if we can look at this line, and knight takes D5, If you just take back on d5, well, this rook takes on c8, and now the bishop or the queen is distracted, and so you drop this pawn in the center. Of course, the game continues. It's not like black has lost, but if you play with your hand rather than playing with your brain, you could drop a pawn immediately. So rook c8, a natural idea, but not the right time for it. In the game, I expect, bishop to f6, Tanya's move, looks very strong to me. This knight, of course, wants to go into c4, but there still will be tactics with this rook lined up on c1. So I think Denis's last move, David, to my eyes, looks like a great choice, and it's causing Alireza to think.
That's a really important step to force the opponent down on the clock. That's where his chances will lie after all, Denis Lazavik. He needs to stay ahead of the opponent. We saw the clock come back to bite him yesterday against Magnus, earlier in the first game against Firouzja. Rook c1, all of these little hidden nuances, these little tactics, a little bit of calculation to do for the first time Firouzja. Ultimately, I think black is still super solid. You can just wait, queen to d7, for example. I don't see any rush, and then start to connect the black rooks, bring one to c8. Black is still fine, but yeah, the clock situation healthier than ever. This is Denis's chance, these next few moves. We talked about urgency earlier in another match. This is urgent, these next few moves, because otherwise pieces will disappear. Those lines that we showed, if they work for black, then it's total safety. There's nothing in between, really. It's not a playable advantage for white. So, wow, Firouzja decided to trade dark squared bishops. Big decision. And we talked about those bishops, the dynamic between them in an endgame favoring black long term. Looks like white is forced to trade them off. But what next, Tanya? Who's happier about this, other than the clock situation where Denis now suddenly up?
If white can trade these dark squared bishops and trade everything on the central square as well, step one done, and take everything on d5, I would think that there's reason to be happy. If you take knight takes d5 at this moment, and if black was to respond, I don't think black should recapture with the pawn. I think that would be a big strategic mistake. But if you were to take pawn takes knight, just fall back with the bishop, and I think the trades really start favoring white. The big question is, what if black takes with the bishop himself? And we actually see a bunch of trades happen. What do we think about that endgame? White's got control over the c file, a knight which can perhaps target the d5 pawn even sooner. And if not, is there anything better than that, Robert? Does white keep the tension, or does white go for these trades?
Difficult choice right now, because the more trades that happen, oftentimes in the back of our head, we're like, the more likely it's going to be a draw. This is not a position with extra material for either side. In fact, both players have placed their pieces on strong squares. This knight on the rim, it's not dim because there are actually some key squares, some light squares the knight can jump into, and white's pieces, they're all protecting one another. So, Tanya, I'm with you. I'm also tempted to take on d5, slam a rook down on c7, but I note that even when my rook lands on c7, the black rook can step up. So I think black is just in time in so many of these different positions. When white tries to go in the offensive, pieces get traded. And that would scare me if I'm Denis. What also would scare me, David, is that Denis is now below 4 minutes. We've seen him get in time trouble. And it's what Magnus said, that Denis, he needs to conserve more time because he can't live on just seconds against these top players.
These top players, they're sharks. They sense a bit of weakness and they really, really kind of up their level of trickery once you're low on time. I think Denis is fighting against his inner demons here. He wants to take on d5. If he didn't need to win at all costs, he would play that move instantly because it removes all risk for white. But as you mentioned, lower risk, also lower potential reward there, unfortunately. And I'm looking at the body language. Denis, looks stressed. Alireza, I mean, I'm not an expert, but he looks super chill to me, Tanya. He looks like he's got everything under control. And if knight takes d5 happens, I think a draw is still the most likely result. So I think, is it justified, Alireza's kind of state of mind right now?
Very different body languages there. And you don't need to be an expert to actually see how relaxed Alireza is about his position, and completely agree. The problem for Denis here is not the position on the board. White's doing absolutely fine. Maybe perhaps White's even happy to get this position that you do, because that bishop on b7, it's behind its own pawn. White's bishop will be more active. You can jump in with that rook to c7, force black to trade on e7, then just fall back with the bishop and keep playing. But it's never going to be enough to call it close to getting those big chances to create a mess. It's a symmetrical pawn structure now, and given the math situation, that's just not enough for Denis Lazavik.
Not clear where he puts his pieces from here. As you said, the roles have been reversed a bit. That's now the black pawn on d5 that will be weaker than the white pawn on d4 because the light square bishop can attack it. But that's not enough to say at some point maybe I'll get to attack a pawn. And we are going down a direct line. So rook e7, that was given a brilliant move. Interesting. I think it's because it sacrificed a piece, but it wasn't a real sacrifice. But we're going down a forcing path because bishop takes. Queen takes. It looks like a knight is hanging, but don't forget about your rook in the corner. So suddenly Denis up a pawn. But David, I'm looking at this, and I think that black has a couple choices. Bring a rook to c8, bring a rook to e8, bring a rook to d8 in the center, and then this knight for black will go into a square like c4. I feel like black's going to be able to regain the pawn.
It feels like it's within the realms of equality, likely a draw if black is accurate, but it is still a bit of an if. And I like the fact that Denis has gone for this variation because when you're low on time, as we mentioned earlier, you need to find forcing moves. You need just easy kind of instinctive moves available. If he'd retreated and not gone for this, then I would have actually feared for him even surviving that game. And a question mark, meanwhile, Tanya, attached to the most natural move in the position. Now the white queen is hit, the white knight is hit. But, okay, Denis clings onto his pawn. How big do you think his winning chances here?
I'm going to be honest, I actually missed that after rook e7, black ends up losing the d5 pawn. And that it's not over till you don't gain that pawn or create direct activity. Also notice the lack of harmony in black's pieces. That knight on a5, it's not coming back into the game for a while right now. Queen e4, a nice centralized square there. White can start improving his own pieces. Put that rook from f1 to d1. Start defending that d4 pawn to free your own knight. It's an extra pawn for white. And I have to say, that's the most that Denis has had this entire game, Robert.
I'm giving and noting that extra pawn on d4. That's a good pawn right there. And I want to point out a star move by Denis Lazavik. Instead of retreating back to f3, which was super tempting, he covers the c4 square. He covers the b3 square. So what I was talking about when I threw to David before was the black knight would get in and likely that Alireza gets his pawn back. No, he is not getting his pawn back. That remains on d4. The knight, it can't jump into c4. Technically, perhaps you can get to b3 at some point because the white queen is tied to the knight on e2, but that's just playing for tricks. I like what Denis has accomplished here, and Alireza, he's the one who should feel a bit nervous. He's glad to be ahead on time. He's unhappy to be down a pawn that, by the way, could start pushing, and once it starts, it may not be able to stop, Tanya.
Completely agree. d5 a big threat. And once that white knight comes into the game, it's going to be more difficult. David, I see that Evalbar seems to say that things are still level for black, but do you think that's deceptive? Does Denis have real chances here?
Very deceptive. It's definitely up to Firouzja to prove it. And yes, the eval bar might say level, but it's going to be a really narrow path for black with supremely high accuracy needed. And okay, rook to c8, really nice move. Actually threatening to come in. And especially while white's king is vulnerable on the back rank, you do start to feel a bit nervous. I was going to say that feature chat earlier. If Denis goes and wins this game, that feature chat earlier saying playing for a draw is risky, that will just be inspired and we'll need to bring it back because it feels like Alireza was playing complacently for a draw for a long time, understandably so, but now he really needs to up his game. Knight c3 blocks that black rook, but the black queen does have an active square to jump to. I'm seeing tactics all over the place now. Big threats on the board. Rook takes knight would undermine white's rook. And suddenly Denis on the defensive. And there was a big threat. He moves the rook away. But black's queen has entered. That's always a bit scary. The blue arrow gives it away. Queen d2, the best move found by Firouzja. 50 seconds against 2 minutes, Robert. Do you think he can still keep enough control here to utilize this extra pawn?
I think that Alireza is doing everything correct. He hitting the rook on e1, hitting the pawn on d4. And if you go back to d1, we've seen this position before. And that rook takes c3 threat, undermining the defense of the rook. As you said, that is what's keeping black in the game. So he goes for the check with Tanya. All of the advantage allegedly is gone. It's given a question mark. But while we see the rooks come off the board, this pass pawn could be more dangerous if white is able to keep it. And after queen e5 check, it looks like you are.
That's going to be the absolute key, right? Can white hold on to this pawn? And the big advantage for white is that the knight on a5 is still one move away from coming to the game. But watch out, there are back rank threats. Once the black king falls back, our blue arrow is telling us king g8 is the best move. White doesn't have time to start pushing that d pawn just yet. There's a big threat. Queen c1 is checkmate. So you've still got to push One, create a lift for your king. Go h3. He goes h4. That is being more aggressive right now. Also eyeing to clamp down Alpha Zero style, h5, h6, creating a mating net against the black king. Finally, black's knight is in the game, but I think this is going to start getting tricky. Queen knight versus queen knight. We might be seeing tactics very soon, David.
Definitely. Already massive threats there. The white knight is hopping in, leaping in. And let's forget the evaluation bar for now. Queen and knights, as we've seen multiple times throughout Division 1 this season already, during the Chessable Masters, they're such a fearsome attacking duo. The perfect combo if you're going for the opponent's king. So Denis, he's left himself with enough ingredients here, enough ammunition to cause threats. Yes, it should be a draw because pawns are disappearing. I'm assuming black's going to take on b2. I'm not sure with which piece. And if the queens ever disappear, black is totally safe. But for now, there's still sufficient winning chances. One hurdle here, Robert, though. I'm still looking at that clock. 30 seconds. It could go wrong so quickly.
It can, but it's also easier for white to play because white's king is safe and sound, and it's black's king that might be in a checkmating net. As we were highlighting the knight hopping into e7, the black king goes to f8, and you're just one slip away from getting checkmated. So knight d5 is automatic. I think that Denis has to play quickly here. It's given the blue arrow. That's not me. But knight e7 check, all of a sudden, it's uncomfortable for Alireza, and he may have a series that only moves himself. You don't just take a pawn on a3. It's not the time to go pawn grabbing in this position. Tanya, you have to be worried for Alireza. In fact, that move, the advantage is going up for white.
It's gonna be a time scramble. Both players under a minute now. Denis is playing under 20 seconds, and it's also good news for white that you played the move h4 because you not only created a lift on h2, also a potential lift on h3 when required. He needs to watch out. There are lines to calculate. Comes in with a check. Black has to move. You still can't push the d pawn. The knight on e7, it can't be picked up. Queen takes knight would lose to queen h8. That knight was not on free.
Checkmate threat. Queen h8 is a big threat. Black needs to play king g8. We see it, Robert, there with the blue arrow. Only move. Firouzja's got 30 seconds. He has to find it. And he does. And the game's still on.
Lazavik down to 2 seconds when he made that move. Let's remind everybody, they gain 2 seconds with every move they play. White is up a pawn again. Knight takes a3. Maybe the b6 pawn drops. So if this d pawn survives, I would actually try to push it as soon as I can. And with the knight maybe coming back to c6, d5 is available with forks on e7. This is really tricky. Alireza, Tanya, he's down under 20 seconds himself.
Yeah, this is just math skills, and they have to be tactically so sharp with mating ideas against the black king. White needs to watch out for any perpetual themes with queen f4 check, but that queen on f6 does a brilliant job. The d pawn has started advancing. Do not grab it. There's a big fork on e7. Things are getting really tricky and out of control here for black. But can he go for a queen trade? He does it because knight jumps back to e5, defending the d7 square.
It's certain control, but wow, there was a moment the white pawn could have pushed forward. Could it push forward now? It's going to be a race. Denis shaking his head. He has to work out that he can push the pawn, he can win the knight, and the knight gets back to stop the b pawn just in time. He's a piece up, but is it enough, Robert? He's winning a knight for pawn on material, but the knight is going to be paralyzed to that b pawn.
But the evaluation bar, it's at zeros, but it's misleading. I actually think white has chances to win this game, and you actually see it's starting to creep up a little bit. The engine itself, not sure. This isn't a table-based position. Too many pieces remain. Objectively, with proper play, it should be a draw. But let's say you push your pawn too early, you may create weaknesses, and white can waste the tempo. This knight can go back and forth, and you already see that the makings of a position where opposition may be required. So, David, this is an end game that's not familiar to either player. Mistakes happen, especially under 5 seconds for each player.
Looks like more mistakes are bound to happen. It should be a draw, but black is barely clinging on here. White's king at the right moment is going to make a dart. There we go for that black h-pawn. And now again, it's a race. Can black just go for this white knight now? He's going for it, Firouzja. But it's a race between the white h-pawn and the black b-pawn. I think he's just in time here, Firouzja, to hold the draw. 4 seconds for Denis. Tanya, I think it's about to end. Nothing to do. No way to keep the game going.
And I think it's going to happen now. This was a desperate try. Denis could not keep the knight alive. They're going to queen at the same time. Denis has to win. He's trying to do that. Both players will queen at the same time, but it's black's move as well. It's Alireza who has the extra pawn. It's not going to be enough to even create a chance here for Denis.
Extra pawn for Alireza, but misplaced king. So if this queen can somehow grab this f5 pawn, you start to feel like you have chances. But look at Alireza bringing his queen to the defense of both, giving some checks. You don't want to drop either of these pawns, so his queen is in the perfect place. Alireza, yeah, he has this under control at this stage. But Denis, credit to him. He played what should have been apparently a losing move, but a draw is the equivalent of a loss for Denis at this stage. Alireza only needs to secure this half point.
And that was such a special position, being down a knight and knowing that you can hold it. David, how confident do you think Alireza was going into that endgame?
It was more necessity than out of confidence that he went for that Firouzja. In the meantime, it is a draw. It is Firouzja who progresses, but Denis threw everything at this game. He got so close. A lot of credit to him. Wow, what a topsy-turvy game. He came so close. Heartbreaking, but he's so impressive, the youngster.